Most Horrific Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, a true horror story that inspired the Exorcism of Emily Rose movie. In the quiet Bavarian town of Klingenberg am Main, Germany, a chilling chapter in modern history unfolded that would haunt the world for decades. It was the story of Anneliese Michel, a young woman whose life became a battleground between faith and science, medicine and religion, and belief and skepticism. Her tragic death on July 1st, 1976, after enduring 67 exorcisms over 10 months, shocked a nation and ignited a global debate about the limits of religious practices and the responsibilities of caregivers. Anneliese Michel was not an ordinary woman. Born into a devout Catholic family, she grew up steeped in religious traditions that shaped her worldview. But her life took a dark turn when she began experiencing seizures and hallucinations as a teenager. Diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy and later depression, Anneliese sought medical treatment for years to no avail. When her symptoms worsened, manifesting as violent outbursts, aversion to religious objects, and disturbing behavior, her family became convinced that she was possessed by demons. What followed was an ordeal that blurred the lines between faith and fanaticism. 2 Catholic priests were granted permission by the church to perform exorcisms on Anneliese, believing they were fighting to save her soul. Over nearly a year, these exorcisms became increasingly grueling and harrowing. Anneliese stopped eating. Her body deteriorated, and she ultimately succumbed to malnutrition and dehydration at just 23 years old. Her death led to criminal charges against her parents and the priests who conducted the exorcisms. The trial that followed captivated the world, raising profound questions about the intersection of religion, mental health care, and legal responsibility. Was Anneliese Michel truly possessed by demons, or was she a victim of undiagnosed mental illness exacerbated by religious fervor? Was her death an act of martyrdom or a preventable tragedy? This is the true story that inspired the Exorcism of Emily Rose, but the reality is far more disturbing than fiction could ever convey. It is a tale of unwavering faith clashing with medical science, of human suffering pushed to its limits, and of a young woman whose life became a symbol of both devotion and neglect. As we delve into the harrowing details of Anneliese Michel's life, exorcisms, death, and legacy, we confront some of humanity's most enduring questions. Where does faith end and fanaticism begin? How do we balance spiritual beliefs with scientific understanding? And what happens when compassion is overshadowed by dogma? This is not just a story. It is a haunting reminder of the fragility of human life when caught between 2 worlds. Chapter 1. The Early Years. Anneliese Michel was born on September 21, 1952, in the small Bavarian town of Liebelfing, Germany. She was the second of 4 daughters in a deeply religious Catholic family. Her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, were devout believers who instilled in their children a strong sense of faith and moral duty. The Michels' lives revolved around the church, and their household was governed by strict Catholic principles that would profoundly shape Anneliese's upbringing, a family steeped in faith. The Michels were part of a conservative Catholic community that adhered to traditional values and practices. Joseph Michel, Anneliese's father, had once considered becoming a priest before taking over the family's sawmill business. Anna Michel, her mother, was equally devout and raised her children with the same fervent beliefs. 3 of Anneliese's aunts were nuns, further embedding religious devotion into the family's identity. However, the Michels carried a burden of guilt that loomed over their household. Before marrying Joseph, Anna had given birth to an illegitimate daughter named Martha in 1948. The stigma of this sin weighed heavily on Anna, who wore a black veil on her wedding day as an act of penance. When Martha died at the age of 8 due to complications from surgery to remove a kidney tumor, Anna became even more determined to lead a life of atonement. This sense of guilt and penance was passed down to Anneliese, who would later take on the responsibility of atoning for perceived sins within her family and community. Childhood, a life of devotion. From an early age, Anneliese displayed a deep commitment to her faith. She attended Mass regularly with her family, often multiple times a week, and participated in daily prayers at home. The Michels prayed the rosary together as a family ritual, and religious icons adorned their home. Anneliese's grandmother, who played a significant role in her upbringing, further reinforced these practices. Despite the strict environment, Anneliese was described as kind-hearted, obedient, and intelligent. She excelled academically and was well-liked by her teachers and peers. Her mother hoped she would one day become a teacher herself, a dream that seemed within reach during her early years. However, Anneliese's childhood was not without challenges. She suffered from several illnesses before the age of 5, including mumps, measles, scarlet fever, and German measles. While these conditions did not appear to have long-term effects at the time, they may have contributed to her physical vulnerability later in life. A shadow of guilt. Anneliese's early years were also marked by an intense focus on sin and redemption. Her mother encouraged acts of penance as a way to atone for both personal and familial sins. For example, Anneliese was reportedly encouraged to sleep on a bare stone floor during cold winter nights as an act of sacrifice for others, particularly for drug addicts and wayward priests whom she believed needed spiritual help. This emphasis on sinfulness created an environment where fear and guilt loomed large. While other children in post-war Germany were beginning to embrace modern freedoms and cultural shifts during the 1960s, Anneliese remained bound by traditional Catholic expectations. This dichotomy between societal change and religious rigidity would later play a significant role in how she perceived her struggles. Adolescence. The calm before the storm. As Anneliese entered adolescence, she continued to excel academically and remained deeply involved in her faith. She joined prayer groups and often volunteered for religious activities at school and church. Her friends described her as generous and well-adjusted, a young woman with strong convictions, but also a gentle demeanor. Yet beneath this outward normalcy lay an undercurrent of anxiety tied to her religious upbringing. Anneliese began to exhibit signs of perfectionism and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for others' spiritual well-being. These traits would later exacerbate her struggles when she began experiencing symptoms that defied explanation, a family burdened by loss. The Michels' devout faith was shaped not only by their beliefs, but also by personal tragedy. The death of Martha left an indelible mark on Anneliese Michel, who saw it as both punishment for her past sins and a call to lead an even more pious life. This sense of loss permeated the family dynamic and contributed to their reliance on religion as a source of solace. For Anneliese, this legacy became both a source of strength and an unbearable burden. She internalized her family's focus on penance and redemption, taking it upon herself to make reparations for what she perceived as collective sins. The calm before the storm. By all accounts, Anneliese Michel's early years were those of a typical devout Catholic girl growing up in rural Bavaria. She was kind-hearted, intelligent, and deeply committed to her faith. Her parents hoped she would lead a fulfilling life guided by religious principles, a path that seemed certain given her dedication. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay unresolved tensions, familial guilt over past transgressions, societal shifts challenging traditional values, and Anneliese's own perfectionist tendencies fueled by fear of sinfulness. These factors created fertile ground for what would later be interpreted as signs of possession, an interpretation that would ultimately lead to one of history's most infamous exorcism cases. As we move forward into the next chapter of Anneliese Michel's life, the onset of illness, we begin to see how these early influences shaped not only her perception of suffering, but also how those around her responded when tragedy struck. Anneliese Michel's early years paint a portrait of innocence intertwined with devotion, but shadowed by guilt, a foundation that would later unravel under the weight of extraordinary circumstances. Chapter 2. The Onset of Illness. The life of Anneliese Michel began to unravel in 1968 when she was just 16 years old. What started as a seemingly isolated medical episode would spiral into a series of events that blurred the lines between neurological illness, mental health struggles, and religious fervor. These early signs of illness marked the beginning of a tragic journey that would ultimately lead to her death 8 years later. The first seizures. In 1968, Anneliese experienced her first seizure while at school. She suddenly lost consciousness and later described feeling as though an invisible force was pressing down on her chest, rendering her unable to move or speak. That night, she experienced sleep paralysis and involuntary urination, symptoms that left her frightened but unsure of their significance. Initially, the episode was dismissed as a one-time event, and Anneliese returned to her normal routine. However, a second seizure occurred in 1969, prompting her family to seek medical attention. She was referred to neurologist Dr. Siegfried Luthi, who conducted an electroencephalogram EEG to assess her brain activity. While the EEG results showed no abnormalities at the time, Anneliese was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy based on her symptoms. Temporal lobe epilepsy is a neurological condition known to cause seizures, hallucinations, memory disturbances, and hyperreligiosity, a heightened preoccupation with religious themes. This diagnosis marked the beginning of Anneliese's medical treatment. She was prescribed anticonvulsant medications, such as phenytoin, to manage her seizures. Despite these measures, her condition continued to worsen over the years. The escalation of symptoms. By 1970, Anneliese's seizures had become more frequent and severe. During one particularly alarming episode at home, she collapsed and began convulsing violently. Her family watched helplessly as her body shook uncontrollably, a terrifying sight that left them deeply concerned about her health. Around this time, Anneliese also began experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. She reported seeing devil faces during prayer and hearing voices that told her she was damned and would rot in hell. These hallucinations were particularly distressing because they occurred during moments of religious devotion, activities that had always been a source of comfort for her. In addition to these symptoms, Anneliese's behavior became increasingly erratic. She withdrew from friends and family, isolating herself in her room for long periods. Her once cheerful demeanor gave way to deep depression and feelings of hopelessness. By 1973, she had become suicidal and expressed a desire to end her suffering. A spiritual dimension emerges. As Anneliese's condition deteriorated, her symptoms began taking on a distinctly spiritual dimension that alarmed her devout Catholic family. She developed an intense aversion to religious objects such as crucifixes and holy water. On one occasion during a family pilgrimage to San Damiano in Italy, a site sacred to St. Francis of Assisi, she reportedly could not walk past a crucifix or drink from a holy spring. She described the ground near the shrine as burning like fire and claimed that religious images emitted blinding light that hurt her eyes. Her family interpreted these incidents as signs of demonic possession rather than symptoms of neurological or psychiatric illness. This belief was reinforced by their deeply rooted Catholic faith and their inability to find relief through medical treatments. Medical treatment fails. Between 1969 and 1973, Anneliese underwent extensive medical treatment for epilepsy and associated psychiatric conditions. She was prescribed various medications over the years, including carbamazepine and anticonvulsant, and paracyanine and antipsychotic. However, these treatments failed to provide significant relief from her symptoms. Doctors struggled to explain why Anneliese's condition continued to worsen despite adhering to prescribed treatments. Some speculated that her hallucinations and behavioral changes were side effects of temporal lobe epilepsy or psychosis caused by the condition. Others suggested that her strict religious upbringing may have contributed to hyperreligiosity, a psychological state characterized by obsessive religious thoughts and behaviors. Frustrated by the lack of progress through conventional medicine, Anneliese began seeking alternative explanations for her suffering. By late 1973, she confided in friends and family that she believed she was possessed by demons. Religious interpretations take hold. Anneliese's conviction that she was possessed grew stronger over time. She told those around her that demons were tormenting her soul and preventing her from living a normal life. Her family supported this belief, interpreting her aversion to religious objects and inability to enter holy places as evidence of possession rather than symptoms of mental illness. In November 1973, Anneliese wrote a letter to Father Ernst Alt, a local priest who would later play a central role in her case, describing her torment. "I am nothing. Everything about me is vanity. What should I do? I have to improve. You pray for me. I want to suffer for other people, but this is so cruel." Father Alt became convinced that Anneliese's suffering was spiritual rather than medical in nature. He noted that she displayed several signs consistent with demonic possession, as outlined in Catholic doctrine: aversion to sacred objects, supernatural strength during episodes, and knowledge of things she could not have learned naturally. A turning point. By 1975, after years of ineffective medical treatment and escalating symptoms, both Anneliese and her family were convinced that traditional medicine could not help her. They turned instead to the Catholic Church for spiritual intervention. Initially hesitant, church officials advised continued medical care, but eventually agreed to evaluate Anneliese's case for exorcism after persistent appeals from the Michels. This decision marked a turning point in how Anneliese's condition would be addressed moving forward. The stage is set. The onset of illness in Anneliese Michel's life reveals a tragic interplay between neurological disorders, psychiatric conditions, cultural beliefs about possession, and deeply ingrained religious practices. What began as treatable medical conditions spiraled into a desperate search for spiritual solutions, a path that would lead Anneliese into one of history's most infamous cases of exorcism. As we move into the next chapter, the decision to pursue exorcism, we see how these early experiences laid the groundwork for what would become an extraordinary clash between faith and science, with devastating consequences for all involved. Chapter 3. The Turn to Exorcism. By 1975, Anneliese Michel's life had become a harrowing ordeal of unrelenting suffering. Years of medical treatment for temporal lobe epilepsy and associated psychiatric symptoms had failed to alleviate her condition, and her physical and mental health continued to deteriorate. Her family, devout Catholics steeped in traditional religious beliefs, became increasingly convinced that her afflictions were not medical but spiritual in nature. This conviction led them to turn away from doctors and toward the Catholic Church, setting the stage for one of the most infamous cases of exorcism in modern history. The failure of medicine. Anneliese's journey through the medical system had been long and frustrating. Since her first seizure in 1968, she had been diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition known to cause seizures, hallucinations, and hyperreligiosity. Over the years, she was prescribed a range of anticonvulsant medications, including phenytoin and carbamazepine, as well as antipsychotic drugs like paracetazine. Despite these treatments, her seizures persisted and her symptoms grew more severe. By 1973, Anneliese was experiencing terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. She reported hearing voices that condemned her as damned and cursed, and seeing devil faces leering at her during prayers. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She tore off her clothes, ate insects, drank her own urine, and exhibited violent outbursts. These symptoms baffled her doctors and left her family desperate for answers. Her aversion to religious objects, such as crucifixes and holy water, further convinced her family that her condition was spiritual rather than medical. When she visited a shrine in San Damiano, Italy, she reportedly could not walk past a crucifix or drink from a holy spring. She described the ground near the shrine as burning like fire, and claimed that religious images emitted a blinding light that hurt her eyes. Such incidents reinforced the belief that Anneliese was under demonic attack. Seeking help from the church. Frustrated by the lack of progress through conventional medicine, Anneliese's parents turned to their faith for answers. They sought guidance from local priests, hoping that someone within the Catholic Church would recognize their daughter's plight as a case of demonic possession. Initially, their pleas were met with skepticism. The Catholic Church has strict criteria for diagnosing possession and granting permission for an exorcism. According to church doctrine, true possession is characterized by specific signs, such as supernatural strength, knowledge of hidden or distant events, speaking in languages unknown to the possessed person, or an intense aversion to sacred objects. While some priests believed Anneliese's symptoms aligned with these criteria, others advised continued medical treatment instead of spiritual intervention. Among those who supported the family's belief in possession was Father Ernst Alt, a local priest who became deeply involved in Anneliese's case. Father Ernst Alt's involvement. Father Alt became convinced that Anneliese was possessed after meeting with her and observing her behavior. He later stated that she did not exhibit symptoms typical of epilepsy or psychosis, but instead displayed signs consistent with demonic possession. He noted her extreme aversion to religious objects and claimed she had knowledge of things she could not have learned naturally. In his correspondence with church officials, Father Alt argued that Anneliese's case warranted an exorcism under the guidelines outlined in the Rituale Romanum, a 17th century Catholic text governing exorcism practices. He also maintained regular contact with Anneliese through letters in which she expressed her torment and desire for spiritual help. In one letter to Father Alt, Anneliese wrote, "I am nothing. Everything about me is vanity. What should I do? I have to improve. You pray for me. I want to suffer for other people. But this is so cruel." Her words revealed both her deep faith and the immense psychological burden she carried as someone who believed herself to be battling forces beyond comprehension. Approval for exorcism. After persistent appeals from Father Alt and Anneliese's family, Bishop Joseph Stangl of Würzburg granted permission for an exorcism in September 1975. The decision came after careful consideration of reports submitted by Father Alt and others involved in evaluating Anneliese's condition. The bishop assigned two priests, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt, to perform the exorcisms under strict secrecy. The rituals would follow the Rituale Romanum, which had been used by the Catholic Church since 1614 as a guide for performing exorcisms on individuals believed to be possessed by demons. This marked a turning point in Anneliese Michel's life. From this moment forward, medical treatment was largely abandoned in favor of spiritual intervention, a decision that would have devastating consequences. The first exorcism session took place on September 24th, 1975. It was conducted at the Michel family home in Klingenberg am Main, with only close family members present. During this initial ritual, Anneliese claimed she was possessed by multiple demons who identified themselves as Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Cain, Nero, Adolf Hitler, and Fleischmann, a disgraced priest from centuries earlier. She spoke in guttural tones attributed to these entities and exhibited violent resistance during prayers. Her body contorted into unnatural positions. At times, she appeared almost superhumanly strong despite her frail physical state. The priests believed they were witnessing genuine signs of possession and intensified their efforts to expel the demons from Anneliese's body. A desperate shift. As the exorcisms continued over the following months, eventually totaling 67 sessions, Anneliese's condition worsened dramatically. She refused food and water for extended periods because she believed fasting would help expel the demons. Her weight plummeted. By June 1976, she weighed only 30 kilograms, 66 pounds. Her physical health deteriorated due to malnutrition, dehydration, and self-inflicted injuries sustained during violent episodes. She performed hundreds of genuflections daily, acts of kneeling and prayer, that caused severe damage to her knees. Despite these alarming signs, neither her family nor the priest sought medical intervention during this time. They were convinced that Anneliese's suffering was part of a spiritual battle against evil forces, a battle they believed could only be won through faith. The turning point. By early 1976, it became clear that Anneliese was nearing physical collapse. Yet she remained steadfast in her belief that enduring this torment was part of God's plan for her life. She reportedly told those around her that she wanted to suffer as an act of atonement for other sins, particularly for wayward youth and apostate priests. This unwavering conviction further solidified her family's support for continuing the exorcisms despite mounting evidence that her body could no longer endure such strain. A path paved with faith. The turn to exorcism in Anneliese Michel's case represents a desperate attempt by a devout family to reconcile their faith with inexplicable suffering. It also highlights how cultural beliefs about possession can shape perceptions of illness, leading individuals to seek spiritual remedies when medical explanations fail. As we move into the next chapter, the grueling process of exorcisms, we see how this decision would lead not only to Anneliese's death, but also to one of history's most controversial legal battles over faith versus science. Chapter 4. The Exorcisms begin. The Exorcisms of Anneliese Michel began on September 24, 1975, marking the start of a grueling and tragic chapter in her life. Over the next 10 months, she would endure 67 exorcism sessions, each lasting up to 4 hours, as her family and 2 Catholic priests sought to rid her of what they believed were demonic entities tormenting her. These rituals were conducted under the guidelines of the Rituale Romanum, a 17th century Catholic text on exorcism. What unfolded during this time was a harrowing descent into physical and psychological suffering, culminating in her death on July 1st, 1976. The first exorcism session was performed by Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Ahl at the Michel family home in Klingenberg, Maine. The priests had received permission from Bishop Joseph Stangl to conduct the rituals after years of unsuccessful medical treatments and growing evidence, at least in the eyes of Anneliese's family and clergy, that she was possessed by demons. During this initial session, Anneliese exhibited behaviors that reinforced the belief in possession. She spoke in guttural voices that seemed to emanate from deep within her, growled like an animal, and displayed violent resistance to prayers. She claimed that multiple demons were inhabiting her body, including Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Cain, Nero, Adolf Hitler, and Fleischmann, a disgraced priest from centuries earlier. Each demon reportedly spoke through her in distinct voices, arguing with one another and cursing those present. The priests documented these sessions meticulously, recording audio tapes to preserve evidence of what they believed were demonic manifestations. These recordings later became infamous for their chilling content. Anneliese's distorted voice growling blasphemies and screaming obscenities. The frequency and intensity of the rites. From September 1975 to June 1976, 1 or 2 exorcism sessions were held each week. Each session lasted several hours and involved intense prayers, incantations, and physical restraint. The priests recited passages from the Rituale Romanum while commanding the demons to leave Anneliese's body. Family members often assisted by holding her down when she became violent or attempted to harm herself. As the exorcisms progressed, physical strain, Anneliese's physical health began to deteriorate rapidly. She performed hundreds of genuflections, kneeling prayers, during each session, acts that eventually caused severe damage to her knees. By the end of the exorcisms, her knees were so damaged that she could no longer walk independently. Self-harm. She exhibited disturbing behaviors such as biting herself, hitting her head against walls, and tearing at her clothes. Aversion to religious objects. Anneliese displayed extreme aversion to sacred items like crucifixes and holy water. She would scream uncontrollably when these objects were brought near her. Refusal to eat. As time went on, she began refusing food and water entirely, claiming that the demons forbade her from eating. Her family stopped consulting doctors at Anneliese's request, relying solely on the exorcisms for healing. This decision marked a critical turning point in her decline. The role of faith and sacrifice. Throughout the exorcisms, Anneliese expressed a profound sense of spiritual purpose. She believed that her suffering was part of a divine mission, to atone for the sins of others and save wayward souls. She often spoke about dying as an act of sacrifice for the wayward youth and apostate priests who had strayed from their faith. In one recorded session, she reportedly said, "I want to suffer for other people, but this is so cruel." Her words reflected both her deep faith and the immense psychological burden she carried. Her mother later claimed that Anneliese exhibited signs of stigmata, wounds resembling those of Christ's crucifixion. But these claims remain controversial and unverified. Escalation of suffering. As the months wore on, Anneliese's condition worsened dramatically. Malnutrition and dehydration. By early 1976, she had stopped eating altogether. Her weight plummeted to just 30 kilograms, 66 pounds, leaving her emaciated and frail. Pneumonia. She developed pneumonia due to weakened immunity, but received no medical treatment. Physical injuries. In addition to her damaged knees, she suffered bruises, fractured teeth from biting herself during seizures or episodes of resistance, and other injuries caused by self-harm or restraint during exorcisms. Despite these alarming signs, neither the priest nor Anneliese's family sought medical intervention. They believed that continuing the exorcisms was the only way to save her soul. Documenting possession. Over 40 audio recordings were made during the exorcisms to document what the priest believed were undeniable signs of possession. These tapes captured distorted voices attributed to demons, screams and growls that seemed inhuman, conversations between demons arguing with one another, blasphemous statements directed at God and religious figures. These recordings would later be used as evidence during the trial following Anneliese's death. While some viewed them as proof of possession, others saw them as disturbing manifestations of mental illness exacerbated by religious fervor. A glimpse of normalcy. Amidst this grueling ordeal, there were brief moments when Anneliese appeared to regain some semblance of normalcy. She managed to attend school sporadically during this period and even completed final examinations at the Pedagogic Academy in Würzburg. For a time, she was able to go to church again, a small reprieve from her otherwise relentless suffering. However, these moments were fleeting. The attacks continued unabated, leaving Anneliese increasingly paralyzed by fear and physical weakness. The final sessions. By June 1976, Anneliese was nearing total physical collapse. During one of the last exorcism sessions on June 30th, the day before her death, she reportedly made two final statements. To her mother, "Mother, I'm afraid." To the priest, "Please, absolution." She could no longer perform genuflections herself. Instead, her parents helped move her through the motions as part of their unwavering commitment to completing the rites. Exhausted, emaciated, and running a high fever due to pneumonia, Anneliese collapsed shortly after this final session. On July 1st, 1976, she passed away at home. A descent into tragedy. The beginning of Anneliese Michel's exorcisms marked a desperate attempt by her family and clergy to save a young woman they believed was possessed by demons. Yet these rituals, intended as acts of spiritual healing, ultimately became instruments of physical destruction. As we move into the next chapter, the final days, we explore how this tragic story reached its devastating conclusion and examine how fate blinded those closest to Anneliese from recognizing the dire reality of her condition. Chapter 5. The Final Days. The final days of Anneliese Michel's life were marked by unimaginable suffering, unwavering faith, and the tragic culmination of a long battle between medical science and religious belief. By June 1976, Anneliese's body had been ravaged by months of starvation, dehydration, and the physical toll of 67 grueling exorcism sessions. Her family and the priests who conducted the exorcisms believed they were fighting to save her soul from demonic possession, while her health rapidly declined to the point of no return. A body broken by suffering. By this time, Anneliese was a shadow of her former self. Once a vibrant young woman with dreams of becoming a teacher, she now weighed only 30 kilograms, 66 pounds. Her body was emaciated and frail, weakened by months of self-imposed fasting. She had stopped eating and drinking entirely, believing that starvation would help expel the demons tormenting her. Her knees were severely damaged from performing hundreds of genuflections during the exorcism rituals, acts of devotion that she insisted on completing despite being unable to walk without assistance. In addition to her physical deterioration, Anneliese suffered from pneumonia and a high fever in her final weeks. Her immune system was severely compromised due to malnutrition and dehydration, leaving her vulnerable to infections. Despite these alarming signs, neither medical intervention nor hospitalization was sought. Her family and the priest believed that continuing the exorcisms was the only way to save her soul. The final exorcism sessions. The last exorcism sessions took place in late June 1976, just days before Anneliese's death. These sessions were even more intense and harrowing than those that had come before. Anneliese's physical condition made it impossible for her to perform the genuflections herself, so her parents helped move her through the motions as part of the ritual. During these final sessions, Anneliese reportedly spoke of seeing visions of the Virgin Mary. According to accounts from her family and the priest, she claimed that Mary had offered her a choice: to ascend to heaven and end her suffering, or to continue enduring torment as a form of atonement for other sins. Anneliese chose to continue suffering, believing it was her divine mission to save others. Her final recorded words during an exorcism session on June 30th were chillingly simple, yet deeply poignant. To her mother, "Mother, I'm afraid." To the priest, "Please, absolution." These statements reflected both her fear in the face of death and her desire for spiritual redemption. The morning of July 1st, 1976. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel passed away in her sleep at her family's home in Klingenberg am Main. She was only 23 years old. Her mother discovered her lifeless body that morning and later described finding peace on Anneliese's face, a stark contrast to the torment she had endured in life. The official cause of death was determined to be malnutrition and dehydration. An autopsy revealed no signs of physical trauma beyond injuries caused by self-inflicted acts during episodes or damage from prolonged kneeling. Her death certificate listed advanced emaciation as the primary cause, which simply means extreme thinness or the state of being excessively thin and wasted. A family in mourning. Anneliese's death devastated her family, who had spent years trying to help their daughter through both medical treatment and spiritual intervention. Her parents, Joseph and Anneliese Michel, believed they had done everything in their power to save her soul from demonic possession. They viewed her death as a tragic but necessary sacrifice, a belief reinforced by their devout Catholic faith. In later interviews, Anneliese Michel expressed unwavering conviction that Anneliese had been possessed and that the exorcisms were justified. She claimed that Anneliese had exhibited signs of stigmata, wounds resembling those of Christ's crucifixion, and described moments when she appeared serene despite her suffering. The aftermath. Anneliese Michel's death sparked shockwaves across Germany and beyond. News of her passing quickly spread, leading to widespread public outcry and intense scrutiny of both her family and the Catholic Church. The case raised profound questions about responsibility. Who should be held accountable for a young woman's preventable death? Was it an act of religious devotion gone too far, or a failure to provide necessary medical care? The answers would be sought in a courtroom during one of Germany's most controversial trials, the trial that would place faith itself under scrutiny. A tragic end. Anneliese Michel's final days remain some of the most haunting aspects of her story. A young woman whose life was consumed by suffering, yet driven by an unshakable belief in a higher purpose. Her death serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of neglecting medical science in favor of religious practices and a testament to the enduring power of faith in moments of despair. As we move into the next chapter, the trial, we explore how this tragic case became a legal battleground between religion and medicine, ultimately shaping public discourse on faith, responsibility, and human suffering for decades to come. Chapter 6. The Trial. The tragic death of Anneliese Michel on July 1st, 1976, after enduring 67 exorcism sessions over 10 months, led to one of the most controversial trials in modern German history. Her parents, Joseph and Anneliese Michel, along with the two priests who conducted the exorcisms, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt, were charged with negligent homicide. The trial, which began on March 30th, 1978, in Aschaffenburg, Germany, became a legal battleground between faith and science, religion and medicine, and personal responsibility versus institutional accountability. The charges. The prosecution argued that Anneliese Michel's death was preventable and that her parents and the priests had failed in their duty, to provide her with necessary medical care. They contended that Anneliese had died from malnutrition and dehydration after months of starvation. Her symptoms were consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy and psychosis, conditions that required medical intervention rather than spiritual rituals. The defendants ignored clear signs of her physical decline and instead relied on exorcisms that ultimately led to her death. The defense countered that Anneliese had been possessed by demons and that the exorcisms were conducted with her consent. They argued that Anneliese herself believed she was possessed and wanted the exorcisms to continue. Her family and the priests acted out of love and faith, genuinely believing they were helping her. The failure of years of medical treatment justified turning to spiritual remedies. Key evidence presented. The trial lasted several weeks and drew significant public attention. Both sides presented compelling evidence to support their arguments. 1. Medical testimonies. Doctors testified that Anneliese's symptoms, including seizures, hallucinations, self-harm, and refusal to eat, were consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy and psychosis. They explained that her condition likely worsened due to a combination of untreated mental illness and the side effects of anticonvulsant medications, such as phenytoin. The prosecution emphasized that Anneliese's death was caused by malnutrition and dehydration, conditions that could have been prevented if she had been hospitalized or force-fed during her final months. 2. Audio recordings. The defense played audio recordings from the exorcism sessions to demonstrate what they believed were signs of demonic possession. These tapes captured chilling moments where Anneliese spoke in guttural voices attributed to demons such as Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Cain, Nero, Adolf Hitler, and Fleischmann, a disgraced priest. The recordings also included screams, growls, and blasphemous statements directed at God. While these recordings were intended to validate the possession claim, skeptics argued that they were manifestations of a young woman suffering from severe mental illness exacerbated by religious delusions. 3. Religious arguments. The defense emphasized Anneliese's own belief in her possession and her desire to undergo exorcisms as a form of spiritual healing. They argued that the priests acted within their religious duties under German law, which protects freedom of religion. Father Alt testified that he believed Anneliese exhibited classic signs of possession as outlined in Catholic doctrine, including aversion to sacred objects and supernatural strength during episodes. Courtroom drama. The trial became a media sensation as it highlighted a clash between deeply held religious beliefs and modern medical understanding. Journalists from around the world filled the courtroom to cover what many described as a battle between medieval superstition and contemporary science. Bishop Joseph Stangl, who had approved the exorcisms but ordered them to be conducted discreetly, did not testify in court. His absence left Father Renz and Father Alt to defend their actions without direct support from higher church authorities. The prosecution painted a picture of negligence rooted in fanaticism. They argued that Anneliese's parents allowed their daughter to die because they prioritized religious rituals over medical care. The defense portrayed the defendants as devout individuals acting out of love for their daughter and faith in God. The court verdict. On April 21, 1978, all 4 defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide. However, their sentences were relatively lenient. The priests received 6-month prison sentences suspended, along with 3 years probation. Anneliese's parents were not punished because the court determined they had suffered enough, a provision allowed under German law for grieving family members. In its ruling, the court acknowledged that while the defendants genuinely believed they were helping Anneliese through spiritual means, they failed in their legal duty to provide necessary medical care when it became clear she was dying. Public reaction. The verdict sparked widespread debate across Germany and beyond. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some viewed Anneliese Michel as a victim of religious fanaticism who died needlessly due to neglect. Others saw her as a martyr who willingly endured suffering for spiritual causes. Many criticized the Catholic Church for its role in approving the exorcisms while distancing itself from responsibility after her death. The trial also raised broader questions about accountability within religious institutions and whether faith-based practices should override medical advice in cases involving mental illness. Legacy of the trial. 1. Impact on religious practices. The case prompted significant changes within the Catholic Church regarding exorcism practices. In 1999, the Vatican issued updated guidelines for exorcisms for the first time since 1614. These revisions emphasized collaboration with medical professionals to rule out psychological or physical conditions before performing an exorcism. The Church distanced itself from claims of possession in Anneliese's case, while acknowledging the possibility of mental illness. 2. Influence on public discourse. Anneliese Michel's trial became a focal point for discussions about faith versus science. It highlighted the dangers of neglecting medical treatment in favor of spiritual remedies. It underscored the need for greater awareness and understanding of mental health issues within religious communities. 3. Cultural legacy. Anneliese's story has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films, including The Exorcism of Emily Rose, 2005, that explore themes of possession, mental illness, and religious belief. These works continue to provoke debate about how society balances faith with evidence-based medicine. Reflections on justice. The trial of Anneliese Michel's parents and priests remains one of history's most profound intersections between religion and law. It serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked faith and an enduring reminder of humanity's struggle to reconcile spiritual beliefs with scientific understanding. Ultimately, this tragic case leaves lingering questions. Was justice truly served? Could Anneliese Michel have been saved if different choices had been made? And how do we ensure that similar tragedies are prevented in the future? These questions continue to haunt those who seek answers in her story, a story forever etched into history as both a tragedy and a lesson for generations to come. Chapter 7. Legacy. The legacy of Anneliese Michel is as complex and haunting as the events that defined her life and death. Her story has transcended the borders of her small Bavarian town, becoming a case study in the intersection of faith, mental health, and societal beliefs. Decades after her death in 1976, Anneliese's name continues to provoke debate, inspire cultural works, and serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of misunderstanding and neglect. Impact on religion and exorcism practices. Anneliese Michel's case profoundly influenced how the Catholic Church approaches exorcisms. At the time of her death, exorcisms were rare in Western nations, often regarded with skepticism or embarrassment by church authorities. However, her case and the global attention it received forced the church to re-examine its practices. Revised guidelines. In 1999, the Vatican issued updated guidelines for exorcisms for the first time since 1614. These revisions emphasize that individuals suspected of possession must undergo thorough medical and psychological evaluations to rule out mental or physical illnesses before an exorcism is approved. This change was a direct response to cases like Anneliese's, where medical conditions were overlooked in favor of spiritual interpretations. Modern collaboration. Today, Catholic exorcists are encouraged to work closely with medical professionals to differentiate between genuine demonic possession, which the Church considers extremely rare, and mental health disorders. The Church now acknowledges that many reported cases of possession are likely misdiagnosed psychiatric conditions. A cautious approach. While exorcisms remain a part of Catholic tradition, they are now performed under stricter oversight. The Church has distanced itself from sensationalized portrayals of possession and emphasized the importance of balancing spiritual care with medical science. Legal and ethical lessons. The trial following Anneliese's death set important legal precedents regarding the responsibilities of caregivers, both familial and religious, in cases involving mental health crises. Negligence and accountability. The convictions of Anneliese's parents and priests highlighted the legal duty to prioritize medical care over religious practices when someone's life is at risk. The court ruled that while their intentions may have been sincere, their actions, or lack thereof, constituted criminal negligence. Faith versus science. The trial underscored the tension between deeply held religious beliefs and evidence-based medicine. It raised questions about how societies should navigate conflicts between faith-based practices and modern healthcare systems. A cautionary tale. Anneliese's case has since been used in discussions about medical ethics, particularly regarding informed consent and the role of family members in making decisions for individuals who may not be capable of acting in their own best interests. Cultural legacy. Anneliese Michel's story has left an indelible mark on popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and films that explore themes of possession, faith, and mental illness. 1. Books. Felicitas D. Goodman's The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, 1981, provides a detailed account of her life, exorcisms, and trial. While criticized for its religious bias, it remains one of the most comprehensive sources on her case. John M. Duffy's Lessons Learned. The Anneliese Michel Exorcism, 2011, examines the ethical failures surrounding her death and advocates for a more standardized approach to diagnosing possession. 2. Films. The Exorcism of Emily Rose, 2005, directed by Scott Derrickson, dramatizes Anneliese's story while blending courtroom drama with horror elements. The film brought her case to a global audience, but took creative liberties with the details. Other films like Requiem, 2006, and Anneliese, The Exorcist Tapes, 2011, also draw inspiration from her life, offering varying interpretations of her ordeal. 3. Documentaries. Numerous documentaries have explored Anneliese's case from both religious and psychological perspectives. These works often include audio recordings from her exorcisms, haunting evidence that continues to divide opinions about what truly happened to her. 4. Media discussions. Her story frequently appears in discussions about demonic possession, mental health stigma, and the ethics of exorcism rituals. It remains a touchstone for debates about whether belief in possession is compatible with modern understandings of psychology and neuroscience. Mental health awareness. One of the most enduring aspects of Anneliese Michel's legacy is its impact on how society views mental health. Stigma reduction. Her case highlights how cultural beliefs can stigmatize mental illness, leading individuals to seek spiritual explanations for conditions better understood through medical science. The importance of diagnosis. Misdiagnosis played a central role in Anneliese's tragedy. Her symptoms, hallucinations, seizures, self-harm, were consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy and psychosis, but were interpreted as signs of possession due to her religious upbringing. Integrated care. Anneliese's story underscores the need for integrated approaches to mental health care that respect cultural and spiritual beliefs while prioritizing evidence-based treatment. A symbolic figure. To this day, Anneliese Michel remains a polarizing figure, a martyr for faith. Some view her as a saintly figure who willingly endured suffering as an act of atonement for other sins. Her grave has become a site of pilgrimage for those who believe she was truly possessed. A victim of neglect. Others see her as a tragic victim whose life was cut short by ignorance and misplaced faith. They argue that she could have been saved if proper medical care had been prioritized over exorcisms. A case study in extremes. For many scholars and clinicians, Anneliese represents the dangers of extreme religiosity when it intersects with untreated mental illness. Lessons learned. Anneliese Michel's story serves as both a warning and an opportunity for growth. 1. Balancing faith and science. Her case illustrates the importance of balancing spiritual beliefs with scientific understanding when addressing complex issues like mental illness or suspected possession. 2. Compassionate care. It highlights the need for compassion over dogma, whether religious or scientific, when caring for vulnerable individuals. 3. Ethics and religious practices. The tragedy underscores the ethical responsibilities of religious leaders to ensure that their practices do not cause harm or neglect basic human needs like food, water, or medical care. Conclusion: a haunting legacy. The legacy of Anneliese Michel is multifaceted, a blend of tragedy, controversy, and enduring questions about faith, responsibility, and human suffering. Her story continues to resonate because it touches on universal themes: our fear of the unknown, our search for meaning in suffering, and our struggle to reconcile belief with evidence. Decades later, Anneliese Michel remains both a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked dogmatism and a symbol of humanity's enduring quest to understand what lies beyond our comprehension. Whether seen as a martyr or a victim, or both, her life serves as a reminder that compassion must always guide our actions when confronting life's most profound mysteries. And that's the end of this video. If you enjoyed listening to this real horror story of Anneliese Michel, then do like, share, comment, and subscribe to Horror Vault in order to watch such stories regularly. I will see you in the next video with another interesting true horror story.